Joining me today for the interview is Pav Wander. Pav is an elementary school teacher with over 15 years' experience, hailing from the same neighborhood where she teaches in the Greater Toronto area. Currently, Pav works with a grade 7 and 8 class and will soon be working as a middle years student success counselor at the Toronto District School Board. Pav is passionate about creating programs at school involving technology, coding, and robotics, while also encouraging her students to infuse and embed their identities and stories into the work that they produce at school. Along with her former teaching partner, Che Cheney, Pav hosts the Staff Room podcast, as well as a live educational music radio show on Voice Ed Radio called The Drive. Pav, you are a busy woman. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Tom. Busy, but not busy enough for this great conversation. I'm so happy to be here and really looking forward to our chat today.
Yeah, I am too. I'm excited to have you here. You and I have just, recently connected, and I
Mhm.
am a loyal subscriber to your podcast. And full disclosure, I was a guest on your podcast this past summer, so I suppose turnaround is fair play, right? So,
Absolutely fair play.
yeah.
And I have to say that it's one of our most listened to episodes. And Che and myself have gone back and listened to that episode several times, passed it on to our principals and colleagues because everything that you bring to the table is so valuable. And we've learned so much about our assessment and feedback practices. From you as well, so thank you. Yeah, the turnaround is definitely. I'm very grateful for it.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. The e-transfer will be on its way shortly for you saying that. But honestly, it's very kind of you to say, and I appreciate it. I really enjoyed our conversation this past summer. But in all seriousness, I have been a listener of your podcast and really enjoy it. And one of the things that I really appreciate about what you and Che do is your level of authenticity as you approach the work and reflect on your work. And of course, as a current practitioner and a podcast host and someone I have come to know as that reflective thinker, about education, we definitely could take this conversation in a number of different directions, and we will go in a few for sure. But I
Mhm.
want to begin with a topic that I know has been currently on your mind, and that is the topic of teacher voice. Why, for you, is teacher voice a topic that you've been acutely paying attention to?
Really great question, Tom. And I have to say that it's because I'm a teacher and I'm just a teacher, and I feel like there's lately, especially, there seems to be this little bit of shame that's attached to being just a teacher, and it makes me think of when mothers say, "Oh, I'm just a stay-at-home mom." Any of us who know and place ourselves in that position know that it's a lot of work and it's enough. And so obviously we know that we are not just teachers, but I feel like because we assert ourselves as just teachers and not, teachers on an administration track or teachers that are department heads or chairs within their school, that they feel like their voices don't matter as much. And I think that that's something that Che and I have both really started to focus in a lot on, and really concentrate a little bit more on the fact that, yeah, our voices do matters. The teachers that are around us, their voices matter very much, and we should be doing what we can to amplify those voices. So it's not solely just about decision making. It's not like, I have ideas and that's a huge part of it.
Mhm.
But it's also my experiences, my reflections, the way that my identities intersect to relate to the students that I have in front of me. There's
Mhm.
so many ways that our voice can add value to education, and that's why Che and I both feel this, that it's something that we need to be amplifying for ourselves more, but also for our colleagues and for teachers that we see all around us. um, I'm getting a little tired of hearing, yeah, okay, so you're just a teacher. What else do you do? What makes you more significant? I don't need to be more significant. I'm a teacher and I'm an active practitioner, and the things that I do in my classroom are important. And so those things need to be highlighted. So uh, teacher voice has been a huge passion of mine, and it's something that I try to bring to the table in almost everything that I do, podcast or just teaching related.
Right. You started by saying there is some shame associated with being quote unquote just a teacher. So can we talk a little bit more about that? Where is that? I know it probably is different for everyone, for teachers, in terms of the minutia, but generally speaking, where is that coming from? Is that coming from society in general? Is that coming from inside the profession? Is it coming from a little bit of both? Where is that shame, that quote unquote shame of being just a teacher, coming from?
I think that it does come from a societal expectation of always needing to be moving forward.
Mm.
Just, you can't sit in the same place for too long, because then you're not doing anything. You're stagnant. But we all know that education is constantly evolving. There's nothing stagnant about it.
Mhm.
Everything is changing, and I know this is something that's going to come up a little bit later as well. And people feel like, well, if you're not doing anything to advance your career, then you're just sitting in the same place and you're not doing anything. You're not evolving as an educator. You're not bettering yourself. You're not bettering education. But we know when we're active practitioners in that place, that that's not the case.
Yeah.
Just as a stay-at-home mom is not just a stay-at-home mom, that mom is managing and is doing everything to run the household.
Mhm.
Teachers are doing the same in their classrooms, and so I think that a little bit of that shame, I can say in my own experience that sometimes that shame gets placed on yourself because you feel guilty,
Right.
maybe for being in the same position for so long and not doing anything for others to see from the outside looking in that you are making some sort of move. But I could just as well be just a teacher my entire career and make huge changes over the course of my career and just evolve to, as I
Mhm.
have in my career, and there shouldn't be any shame attached
Right.
to that. So
It
I
rem
think, yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of my days even as an administrator, where if you were a vice principal, there was kind of this inherent pressure and a little bit of either mocking or cynicism about the quote unquote career vice principal, and that if you
Mhm.
weren't aspiring to become a principal, if you're as a teacher, and that you are in various stages of refinement. I think if we're constantly seeking the new and the advancement, we never have a chance to let ideas kind of come to fruition and refine them and hone our craft in that way. So I think your
Mhm.
point is well taken about how there is that societal. I mean, we did go through a little blip during the pandemic where society saw teachers as heroes, and they finally saw teachers for the people that they actually are in our society. And yet, of course, it reverts back, and there are
That's
those
right.
societal ideas that come to the forefront. I
Yeah.
know that you have a recent assertion I saw on social media, and by the way, social media doesn't help with this either, with people
No.
constantly talking about the new, and we're always, even if it's just semantics and changing words. But on social media, you recently asserted that, quote, the seeking of teacher voice is often performative and more about seeking validation on predetermined decisions than the seeking of new understandings and insights. So here's my question. From a teacher perspective, what advice would you give to school leaders or district leaders to ensure that when they seek teacher voice, it is authentic and not performative?
Yeah, great question, Tom. I think that in order to move away from that performative nature of seeking teacher voice, it needs to be consistent. And it needs to be happening based on all kinds of school-based decisions, just not just here and there plucking teachers and say, hey, what is your opinion on this? But making sure that there's teacher representation in everything that's happening within the school community. And so I think that sometimes we say that, but it doesn't actually come to fruition because people revert back. They go back to their comfortable spaces, and putting those things into action is sometimes difficult. You brought up social media a couple of days ago. I made a bit of a tweet that was a little bit in jest. And it went viral, which it's never really your intention. It's like, I wish that some of my other content would go
Right.
viral in this
That's
way,
right.
maybe not this one. But
Yeah.
it asserted that there needs to be more experience for administrators when they are teachers. Like, they need to spend more time as teachers, and it ruffled a few feathers, but then there was a lot of support in that. And so, um I think that what needs to happen is a little bit of greater empathy when it comes to administrators understanding what some of those plights are that teachers are experiencing. So if you don't have a vast amount of experience being a teacher before you become an administrator, then you need to be spending some more time with teachers in the teaching space, in the classroom, to truly understand why some of the things that teachers are voicing are being voiced. Really get to know the root of the problem. Spend a little bit more time to see where some of those struggles are, and maybe where the voice is coming from. And I'm not saying that the voice is always, complaining in nature, or talking about the things that are lacking, but oftentimes just understanding why something is being brought to the table, it can be difficult if you haven't spent a lot of time truly understanding where the teacher is coming from. So I
Yeah.
think that in order to avoid that performative nature, really get to know your staff. Like, I mean,
Mhm.
this is going to come up again, but relationships truly matter between administration and the teachers, and really getting to know where that experience is coming from and why it matters in the classroom setting. So
Yeah.
I think empathy is a huge part of that. Getting to know teachers and what's going on in the classroom is very important to that as well. So and then actually try the ideas, right? Things that teachers bring to the table, they shouldn't be dismissed. Like, really give teachers an opportunity to bring something in and try
Yeah.
it. And just to give it a shot. You never know, sometimes it's worth it. And teachers, they are the most qualified people in their spaces, and so they do know what they're talking about, and sometimes those things really work out well for the school.
Yeah, I have seen your point about rapid acceleration of a career or advancement. I've seen examples of that, not personally, but certainly in districts I've worked in, where the advancement into administration is rather rapid. Not a lot of teaching experience behind that, which sometimes, in fairness, districts are desperate to have people in positions. But I think your point about being open to learning. I mean, teachers at times really lean on administration for perspective and for balance. And if you don't bring that experience to the table, then it's the idea of being open to learning
Mhm.
more or understanding more about the teacher's experience, because it's hard, for someone who's taught for 4 years is suddenly an assistant principal, and yet there's a 20-year veteran who's seeking support and balance of perspective, and you really can't bring that to the table. And that's,
Mhm.
in fairness to them, you can't invent experience, but being open to that conversation and being empathetic about the plight, instead of just
Mhm.
dismissing it because it's coming from quote unquote just a teacher, as we talked about before. So I think that point,
Yeah.
really important that we approach the work, because part of it, yeah, if you want to be a manager, then that's great.
Yeah.
You probably can do that after 3 or 4 years of teaching. But if you want to be an instructional leader and you want to be able to have credible conversations with teachers about best practice, about what a refining practice, about what might work with students, that experience is invaluable for sure. So now let's maybe turn the tables a bit, because I think consultation, teacher voice can be tricky, right? Because if we
Mhm.
turn the tables, it's also quite possible that an administrator seeks teacher voice authentically, but the input is not really followed or used. That maybe the input was about a potential decision where there were several directions that we could go, and the decision was made that did not match the input that the teacher gave. So it was nothing performative about it. It was just a choice that leadership made, or department made, or something like that. So the first part of this two-part question is, what should teachers keep in mind? In that kind of scenario, what is the best way to kind of handle a situation where your input has been authentically sought by leadership, but your advice was not taken? So how
Mhm.
might teachers keep perspective on that? And I have a follow up to this, but let's go with that first part.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it had me actually reflecting a lot on my own experience as a teacher, and things like this has happened to me, and
Mhm.
and I think back, did I deal with it the best possible way? Maybe not. I don't know, but
Yeah, yeah,
but like all great practitioners, we reflect and we go back and we say, well, okay. Um, what needs to happen in that situation. And I think that teachers need to understand that the hardest part is voicing your opinion. And
mhm,
so I think that that is something that shouldn't stop. So teachers, don't be deterred by that when it happens, because it will happen. There's
Mhm.
often a lot of red tape that needs to be cut through, when we bring ideas to the table, and that's happened to me quite a few times. We can't be deterred by it. But then we go back to the fact that relationships do matter. And so if we have a good relationship with our administration, then we know that we can continue to bring ideas and opinions to the table, and that shouldn't stop.
Yeah.
And then also there needs to be clear communication that is consistent, and transparency. So, as a teacher, I shouldn't be keeping anything, behind me to say, okay, if I get permission to do this, then eventually I'll be able to do whatever I want. We need to be transparent with our ideas, and always understanding that it's in the best interest of our students, and our pedagogies, and the things that we want to do in our classroom, our best
Mhm.
practices. So, don't be deterred by any decisions that are made that maybe don't take your opinion into consideration. But of course, at the same time, if it is a pattern, then maybe
Mhm.
that's something that comes back to the communication bit, and the relationship bit, that maybe there's something that needs to be explored a little bit further there. But
Mhm.
but I think, yeah, as a teacher, we need to continue to remain consistent with our communication coming from us, and be transparent, and understand that sometimes this is the hardest part, is actually speaking up and saying, well, I really think that we should be doing this way,
Right.
or I would really like to share my experience on this matter.
Mhm.
And in my opinion, or in my experience, that has been difficult. But then once we are doing it more often, it becomes a little bit easier.
Yeah. I think it's important for all of us in any consultation situation to recognize the big picture, which is that our input or our advice isn't always going to be
Hmm.
taken. But let's flip this around again now back to leaders, because,
Hmm.
from a teacher perspective, what can or should leaders, maybe proactively do to ensure that teachers don't misunderstand or inadvertently think the exercise was performative? When we don't take the input as administrators, as leaders, what do teachers need in that situation? So what advice would you give to, say, school administrators or district level, to say, if you're not going to follow teacher input, what should we do to make sure that teachers don't feel a little bit, end up becoming a little cynical about the process?
Yeah, and I think I'm gonna repeat the first 2 points that I made the
Okay.
last time, that relationships matter, and there needs to be clear and consistent communication that is
Hmm.
transparent,
Yeah.
because it needs to be coming from both sides, of that relationship. And so knowing, I think, where the motivating factors are, and it goes back to, spending that time getting to know the plights of the teachers, and where some of these ideas might be stemming from. What are the struggles that are leading to these ideas, these opinions, these recommendations from teachers? Understanding that bit is very important. So spending time with teachers, and then again, coming back with ideas that might assist with those struggles, like getting to the
Right.
root of the problem. you
Hmm.
you made a suggestion, teacher, and unfortunately we couldn't use it. I want you to know that I care. I want you to know that I want your experience in the classroom to be better. So here are some alternative options that we can try.
Hmm.
So I'm not dismissing you. I am not dismissing the things that you are experiencing, the struggles that you might be experiencing. We can't try this, but here's X, Y, and Z that we can
Hmm.
try. So actively bringing those options to the table, these alternatives to the table, I think is important as well. And I think that keeps the relationship moving, and it keeps it strong. And hopefully that takes things into a more action based relationship, rather than that performative
Right.
stuff that we sometimes see.
I often, think about some of the lessons I learned in leadership, and something that I definitely learned and grew into and kind of learned in real time was making sure that if you weren't going to use the input or use the advice in a consultation scenario, that the people who provided input, if you're not taking their advice, you owe them an explanation as to why. You
Mhm.
explain to them why that advice, even though we appreciate the input, here's why we couldn't do that or can't do that. And then your suggestion of, hey, we can't do this, but maybe here's a hybrid, or maybe here's
Mhm.
a possibility to kind of at least satisfy part of what we're trying to resolve. And the more I learned that, and again, experience comes from poor judgment. You make mistakes, you learn from it. But for me, understanding that teachers need explanation, and then once that explanation, and as you say, if the relationship is there, the trust is there, then we can move ahead, and we are actually better because of it, because there is that constant communication. I
Yeah.
want to shift to another topic that you recently talked about in your podcast, and I was really taken with your reflection on the concept of teaching loss. We've all heard about the idea of learning loss, and likely everyone has some kind of opinion about it. Last February, I ranted on my podcast, and this podcast
Mhm.
listeners might remember about the myth of learning loss last February. But you were so eloquent in talking about teaching loss on that episode that I'm hoping you can bring that here. So, what is, from your perspective, the concept of teaching loss, and why is it something that we have to consider right now?
Yeah, teaching loss is, it's very an emotional response for me, or an emotional reflection that I've been feeling for the last year and a half. And it's this idea that there are experiences as teachers that we have missed out on because of the pandemic, because of loss within the classroom. Because of the missed time that we have had. And I first experienced this idea of teaching loss when I was off on my 2 maternity leaves. And so I
Mhm.
was I was off for a year, so 2 years in total. And I felt this great sense of loss. Like, I've education kept going, but I wasn't there for it. I wasn't there to experience it. And the changes, the evolution that happens within education. So again, I it was a very familiar feeling when we were in COVID and we couldn't do the things that we normally do, and we missed out on opportunities. We missed out on making connections. We missed out on professional development, or working towards some of our educational or professional goals. And so that was where that really came from, the idea of teaching loss. And it was something that I guess a lot of people were able to, it resonated with a lot of people, that this whole idea. And so there were a lot of reflections coming from all over the place. And, there are this is where I experienced loss over the last year and a half as a
Okay.
teacher. And I think that this is something that's a little bit harder to dismiss,
Mhm.
because it is such a personal feeling of where some of this loss has come from, and how we as teachers, as educators, have experienced that teaching loss.
Mhm.
And so I outlined, there, I wrote a blog, and then
Mhm.
also used it as a oral reflection as part of the podcast as well. But there were 6 areas that I felt that I had experienced loss. And so that was making connections with teachers and students. So there's a whole cohort of students that have passed through the school that I have no idea who they are.
Right.
And it's something that we still talk about. Che teaches has been teaching at the same school for his entire career, and he has never gone through a group of students that he didn't know in one way or another.
Right.
And so that's something that's different for me, because I tend to move around schools a lot. But for a teacher who has been in the same place for a long period of time, that is a weird experience. That, I haven't coached any of these kids. I haven't done any extracurricular activities with these kids. I don't know them. And
Mhm.
so it's a little bit of a different experience to be in the classroom with them. You have to get to know them from the very beginning, and that can be a weird feeling. Leadership opportunities is another one. There, a whole 18 months has gone by, and there are many teachers that were planning to move up to administration, needed to take some courses, or get the experience that's needed for that, and they couldn't make that opportunity, and it could have been a missed opportunity. There are people that just kind of gave up on some of those things that they were aspiring to do because of that missed time.
Mhm.
Professional development is another one I remember mentioning in the blog, that that there were large amounts of money that are usually dedicated towards professional development in the school budget that went unused. And when you take a look at that number, that amount, you sort of realize how much professional development we were maybe passively receiving, and that didn't happen. And so you wonder, maybe did my practice suffer because of that loss, because I didn't get to experience it. And that can be negotiable. That can be yes or no. But regardless, we missed out on it. There's testing new pedagogies. So I've
Mhm.
learned a lot. I haven't been able to apply it, right? So there's that sense of loss.
Mhm.
Teaching evolving content, new curriculums that have come out in the last little while that I haven't been able to teach. And then of course the extracurriculars and getting to know students, and that's still, I'm still experiencing that loss, because there are a lot of great programs that we run in our schools that students don't get to have if they're not in school. And so, robotics programs, coding programs that can
Right.
cost a lot of money if you're going to, places outside of the school setting to get them. And so a lot of students are not missing out on that. And I know that sounds a little bit selfish, self-centered for the teacher to think that they missed out on something, but providing that opportunity for students is something that I pride myself on,
Mhm.
when sometimes it's not available to students. And so not being able to do that can be pretty challenging, and I felt that loss as well. So a very reflective idea, but one that has resonated with many. And so I think there's a little bit of validity in exploring that teaching loss topic a little bit further.
Yeah, it is certainly not selfish to focus on self. Listeners, you'll remember from last week my conversation with Tina Bogren about self-care for educators, and how important it is for teachers to focus on themselves so that they can be better for their students. Pav, I'm wondering, now that you recognize this idea of teaching loss, what I know you can only speak for yourself because this is a very personal thing for everyone. How are you handling it? What are you doing? What are some ways, maybe your strategies or your approach can help others who are also experiencing the same feeling? So how are you approaching this now that you realize this is a thing, this is something that you're dealing with? What's the strategy, or what's the approach that you're taking with trying to maybe not eliminate it, but just understanding how to cope?
Yeah, and I think that coping is basically what all we can do, because loss is
Right.
loss.
Yeah.
And so I am much more intentional. When I am receiving professional development, I'm not just sitting there going, okay, this is an hour and a half that I have to get through in my life.
Right.
This is an hour and a half that I am getting right now that in the future I may not get because of whatever reason.
Mhm.
So, I'm a little bit more grateful for some of the experiences that I do have.
Mhm.
When I do get an opportunity to embed some of the things that I didn't get to do, such as, extracurricular things, I try and embed them a little bit more in my teaching. So try providing those extracurricular activities within the
Yeah.
curriculum. So I'm a little bit more intentional about that. But there are some things that you can't make up for. Leadership, I know that it can be argued that you can seek those types of opportunities on your own, and you don't need to be in school for those. And so, if there is something that I feel like I am missing out on, I spend a little bit more of my own personal time trying to accomplish some of those goals. So but I think that that intention, that mindfulness, the gratitude for when I am in those situations is a way that I am coping with it. And then just sort of putting it behind me, and grieving it, and then moving on, because
Mhm.
I can't get the time back, but I can, make changes to things as they go forward, and being a little bit more intentional with the way that I approach these 6 areas
Yeah.
moving forward. So yeah, as you said, it is a very personal thing that we do. And I think that in the reflections that I've seen from other people, I think that intention is something that's top of mind now as we move forward.
It strikes me that maybe even the awareness alone is
Mhm.
helpful to realize that what you're feeling, where it's sourced, where it's coming from, to be able to name it. The whole idea of naming it and noticing and
Mhm.
understanding where it's coming from, that alone can at least help with the coping of that situation. Certainly, something that every teacher is reflecting on and experiencing. Your point about the students. I've worked with some teachers this year who have students in the 10th grade. They've moved into high school after middle school, but the pandemic came when they were at the end of grade 8.
Right.
They spent their first year of high school in ninth grade. They spent that first year in remote learning. And now they
Mhm.
have 10th grade students in their school who've never set foot in their building until this fall. And I don't think
Yeah.
we realize the kind of, even though we can name and notice it, I don't know that we know what the residual effect of all of this, because we're still in the midst of it. We're not done with the pandemic. And certainly there's
That's right.
maybe other things to come. Okay. Before we finish up today, Pav, we have to talk about the podcast, because I want listeners to know about the Staff Room podcast. So let's talk about a few things. Where did this idea come from? What is the sort of main focus? Listeners who aren't familiar with the podcast, tell us a little bit about, obviously I know, but tell us a little bit about what the main focus of the podcast is, and how did you and Che end up becoming this dynamic podcasting duo?
Okay, I'll start with the podcast
Yeah.
itself. The Staff Room podcast is very reflective in nature. And Che and myself, Che Cheney, he's a former colleague. I wouldn't say former colleague. I
Yeah.
used to work with him in the same school. We don't anymore. But
Mhm.
we've remained as active co-teachers. So we share Google Classroom and all kinds of resources, and we're helping each other all the time. But the podcast was a way when we first started, and it still is in many ways, a way for us to just reflect on things that have happened in our classroom. And as we talked about these things, we got a little bit deeper into some of the experiences that we've had and where those experiences are coming from. So we used it as an opportunity for us to just reflect, a little bit of comedic banter to kind of, it's just like hallway conversations between you and a colleague, and just talking about the things that have happened and reflecting on why they happened. How did it begin? Um, I was teaching rotary science. An old friend of mine had come, who I went to school with, um, said, "I know you still teach in the community that we grew up in, and I'd like to give back something to the community." He's a real estate agent, but he has a podcast, and he's got like a podcast that is very well produced. He's got a graphic designer and a copy editor and a producer and a studio and all of this stuff. And he said, "I'd love to do something that gives back to the community a little bit and the students and something. Do you have any ideas?" And I said, "Well, podcasting. The students have never been exposed to something like this, and it would be really cool for you to just come in and maybe run a workshop on how to do a podcast." And little did he know that Che and I were taking notes in the back, going, "This sounds really cool. We should do this."
Yeah.
So you brought in Che's class. So I was teaching rotary science. I brought this to Che and I said, "You've got a class and you do Genius Hour in your class. This seems like something that would work really well with Genius Hour, and really researching particular topics and talking about them." And so my friend Jazz brought the entire class to the studio and taught them how to use the equipment and how, with the process of creating a podcast. And then he interviewed Che and myself for the podcast as well. And the exhilaration that we felt during that recording, that interview, we said, "We have to do this. This is
Mhm.
something that we need to do." And so we started our own podcast with Jazz and Laura's help from the REC team. And they gave us, all kinds of help in starting our own podcast. And that's essentially what we did. We said, we're just going to sit around once a week. Well, the plan was once a month, and then it turned into 3 times a week.
Mhm.
So we just sat around and we talked about, this is what happened in,
Yeah.
this topic. And it just kind of, the feedback that we got from people was, "I can see myself sitting at the table with you guys and having this conversation and talking about the stuff that happened in your class." And there were so many times that I
Mhm.
nodded my head and said, "Yes, the same thing happened in my class," or "This is the experience that I had." We got into eventually some deeper topics. And we talked about things like imposter syndrome and, all kinds of toxic positivity and these
Yeah.
things that we see in social media, and how could these things be affecting our students and in our classroom, or even us as teachers. And so that's really where that went. How did Che and I become the dynamic duo that we are? Che and I, it's very interesting because we're very different people, different upbringings, different entry points into education. But we share a very similar inquisitiveness, curiosity, and wanting to explore education a little bit. And we're not afraid to try new things. And I think that
Mhm.
that was just the perfect recipe for creating this. Che and I don't always agree on topics, but we're very open to hearing each other's perspectives.
Mhm.
And so I think that what that has done is has created a real safe learning environment for us and for listeners. And
Mhm.
so we talk about some really difficult topics, but we're able to bring different insights and different viewpoints, which has helped a lot in each other's understanding and also brings those different perspectives to the listeners so that they can hear multiple perspectives and viewpoints as well. So, I think that that's where that comes from. So we're very, very different, which you can
Mhm.
tell by
Yeah.
looking at us, hearing us, and all of that. But we share a lot of similarities and common ground, and I think it's that common ground that sort of makes us as dynamic as you say we might be.
The dynamic duo, yes. Listeners, if you have not listened to the Staff Room podcast, what you'll find out right away that Pav and Che are quite different with the way that Che typically introduces himself on the podcast. So
Right.
we'll just leave that there and let you find out what I
Well,
mean by that. You do have one thing in common that I often see on social media, and that is both of you at the batting cages, hitting this, working on your swing, I suppose, for slow pitch season next year. I suppose, but it's a really I think the connection between the two of you, in all seriousness, is authentic, and I think from my perspective as an outsider, it's why the two of you can go to certain depths in conversations, because there's obviously a trust between the two of you in terms of perspective and the voice that you're
mhm.
bringing to the conversation, and I've come to really appreciate that in listening to your podcast. Okay, I've got two questions left for you, Pav.
Okay.
Questions that I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. And here's the first one. And you can definitely take this in any direction. It doesn't have to be about what we've talked about so far. It could be something, any direction you want to go with this one. Here's the first one. Educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
So lately, this has been the swift shift in pedagogies or the inconsistencies in I guess pedagogical exposure for students. Is this something that is inadvertently harming our students? So that's something that I think about. Things are moving so fast, especially now. Post COVID or during COVID, I would say. There's a lot of things that are shifting really quickly. There are a lot of pedagogical methods that are shifting, and what I'm always thinking about is are students going to be able to pull what they need from the way that we have been teaching, and a lot has changed in the last few years, and use that to become successful parts of the society. Are they going to be able to do the things that they want to do um, with everything that has changed? And so I'm often thinking about that, and I'm often thinking about um, where has been my role in either helping that situation or harming the situation, in shifting so many times and trying new things and saying, okay, well, now we should be doing this, so let's do this. Are students ready for it, and are they able to be as resilient as we think that they are in absorbing those changes and
Mhm.
making those shifts for themselves in order to be successful? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's that evolution process. Are we evolving education too quickly or trying to?
Yeah. It reminds me, it's almost coming full circle to what we talked about earlier, which was the idea of, the just a teacher. And then if you're not constantly advancing, not constantly
Yeah.
changing, you're somehow doing something wrong. And I think that's a very important concern, is that sometimes what we're doing needs refinement and
Mhm.
needs to be worked on and does not need to constantly change. So I
It needs
appreciate that.
mastery.
Right.
Sometimes all we need is a little bit more mastery before we can move on to something new.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we have to give things time to play out, for sure. Okay, last question. And this question I ask everyone that's been on the podcast about. It's basically a general question about success and happiness. And the question is, if a random person stopped you on the street and said, "What's your definition of success?" How would you answer them?
I would say that my idea of success would be achievement based on practical application of skills that I have acquired over time.
Mhm.
And I'll give you a little bit of an anecdote to help with that understanding. It's I was in my Muay Thai training this morning, and lately the last couple of weeks we've been doing a lot of drill and kill, a lot of skills practice, and not really applying the skills, or not, creating these complicated combos to practice. And I find myself, getting a little bit bored sometimes with the skills drill and kill training, just
Right.
the
Right.
same combo over and over and over again. And so the professor passed by as I was practicing, and I kind of, I stated that. I said, this is a little bit boring. I gotta say, like, when are we gonna get to the good stuff? And it was his response was, your skills have to be so second nature that when you pull them out, the only thing that you need to be making, the only decision that you need to be making is which skill am I going to use, or what tool am I going to be using. You shouldn't have to be thinking about did I perform the skill correctly. And
Mhm.
so, I was thinking to myself, yeah, you make a really good point. And then we did some sparring, and then it was okay. Now you can take those skills that you've been practicing over the last few weeks and use them, and you will see when you are successful. You will see that, you've achieved something when you were able to pull the right tool out to use it in the most practical way. And
Mhm.
so I think, for myself, that is success, when I can take the skills and the knowledge that I've acquired over time and apply it in the most practical way. I think that's pretty successful.
So, reflective thinker and somebody you don't really want to make angry because you might pull out the skills on us, and there's a little bit of a flex there, Pav. I appreciate that, and I just happened to be at my class this morning, dropping people like flies.
That's
But
right.
no, I really appreciate the application, the idea that I can draw upon those skills. I think that really does put us in that successful position. Listeners, there are an abundance of ways that you can connect with Pav. Obviously on Twitter. Pav's Twitter handle is at Pav Wander. And also, please follow the at Staff Podcast Twitter handle on Facebook and Instagram. The Staff Room Podcast is available there. LinkedIn, you'll find Pav at Che and Pav, the Staff Room Podcast. Pav also blogs, and you can check out some of her reflections and musings at the cheandpav.com/blog. Listeners will have links to all of that in the show notes, so please check those out, and make sure you follow Pav, and check out the Staff Room Podcast. It's a really great reflective conversation between Che and Pav. So Pav, it's been great having you here. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom. It's always a great time when I get to talk to you. So I'm so honored and so blessed that you invited me on. I had a great time today.
Yeah, thanks for being here.